So hi everyone, welcome to this panel that we've put together tonight. This is part of the Master of Professional Writing Program's parallel curriculum, as we call it. We have our ongoing curriculum with our classes and workshops and bless you and seminars. And then we have this ongoing sideways curriculum where we bring in writers and agents and editors and folks to talk to our students about the writing life and different aspects of writing. So it's nice to see everyone here tonight. Thanks for coming out. And I really want to thank our panelists for joining us tonight. On the far right is Richard Rayner. In the middle is Judith Freeman. On my right is Hector Tobar. I'm BRIGHDE MULLINS. I'm the director of MPW. And I also want to thank our MPW program team, Clark and Howard. And so MPW is a creative writing program. Although we're called professional writing, we're really creative writing, for your information. We introduce writers to many different forms of writing. So poetry, playwriting, screenwriting, new media, fiction, nonfiction. We sort of have a broad gamut of different writing styles and forms, and we look at the way that different forms inform each other and talk to each other. We're also very responsive to being located in Los Angeles, what it means to live here, what it means to be an artist here. For many of the students in our graduate creative writing program, attending MPW meant making a pilgrimage to this place, to Los Angeles. Carson McCullers says, if you're going to write, you better have some place to be from. So we're very aware of the kind of alchemy that a place has with a person. So tonight's panel brings together three Angelenos. And Angelenos is defined as natives or inhabitants of Los Angeles. So, and these are three very prolific Angelenos. So this was an ambitious idea to put together this panel, and it's a conversation that we hope is only just beginning among our panelists and our students. All three of tonight's panelists have written extensively about Los Angeles. I could teach a full semester on each of their work. So this tonight will sort of be a condensed version. I asked each of them to suggest a work that I could read to prepare for tonight. And these books are available to you at the back of the room through the courtesy of the USC bookstore. Thank you very much for coming, and I'm sure our panelists would be happy to sign books for you afterwards. I want to briefly introduce the panelists and then sort of, I hope, jumpstart a conversation among them. And then after about 35 minutes, we'll open the conversation to you. So if you feel questions or associations brewing, make note of them, and we'll have time afterwards, after our initial conversation. It's so nice to see so many of our students here. Novelist and nonfiction writer Judith Freeman, who's in the center, has just delivered the prestigious Haynes Lecture on American History at the Huntington Library. Oh, please turn off your cell phones. Judith's novels include The Chinchilla Farm, Set for Life, A Desert of Pure Feeling, and Red Water. For tonight's panel, I reread the middle section of her wonderful first novel, The Chinchilla Farm, in which LA is seen through the eyes of Verna Flake, who is fantastically adept at describing Los Angeles. And one really amazing sensory passage, she says, the feeling of the city is first of all sound. The freeway was a faint, constant hum, and it goes from there. Judith's latest book is The Long Embrace, Raymond Chandler, and the Woman He Loved. In this meta-biography and meditation, Judith explores the relationship that Raymond Chandler had with the Los Angeles that was the catalyst and the setting of his novels. It's a remarkable book that is not only an homage to Chandler, it gives new insight into both Judith's process and to Chandler's process. Judith has said that the writing of this book turned her into a detective herself, and indeed it reads like a mystery as she explores and expands Chandler's relationship with his wife Sissy, their creative partnership, and their terrain, the Los Angeles that he made iconographic. Judith has been a longtime member of the faculty here at MPW. Our next panelist, Richard Rayner, has written memoirs, journalism, screenplays, and novels. His memoir, called The Blue Suit, is a coming-of-age story set at and around Cambridge University. He has also written of and about Los Angeles, and his books include Drake's Fortune, The Cloud Sketcher, The Associates, and several other books. His book, L.A. Without a Map, chronicles his early days in L.A. His most recent book is called A Bright and Guilty Place. The title is from Orson Welles. It's a nonfiction history which relates to certain true crimes that happened in L.A. in the 20s and 30s, and it shows how those crimes fed very directly into the fiction of Chandler. And this is part of what Richard calls the psychic mulch of living here. On my right is, and Richard is currently teaching a fiction workshop in our program. And reading a lot of Chekhov, I hear, with the students. Hector Tobar has been a weekly columnist and a foreign correspondent for the LA Times. He's received the Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of the 1992 riots. His books include Translation Nation and The Tattooed Soldier. His latest book, The Barbarian Nurseries, is the story of Araceli Ramirez, a wondrous protagonist, a sort of Mexican Leopold Bloom, and her odyssey through the timescape of Los Angeles. She is a completely new character in fiction, and she is a conduit through which the reader learns about LA in brilliant, hilarious, and poignant detail. These are three writers who have created bodies of work that speak to and about Los Angeles. And there are three very different takes on Los Angeles, as far as I can see from my weekend reading. No doubt inflected by their own experience of place. And how we think of a place is through its available mythologies and through our experience of it, of course. With LA, the 800-pound gorilla, especially for an artist, is of course the lens of Hollywood. It's what Bertolt Brecht called the bourgeois narcotics factory. But parallel to this is the city of writers, novelists, poets, nonfiction writers, this simultaneity. So what I wanted to talk to tonight with our panelists, what I wanted to talk about is this idea of place, the specificity of Los Angeles. Hector is a native. Richard is an expat, if I may be so bold, and Judith is a transplant. So we have three different ways of coming to Los Angeles. So part of what I thought we might start with is the idea of Los Angeles that people have. If you had it outside of being a citizen of Los Angeles, or from the inside, and how you address that in your work, or how you experience it imaginatively. And I don't know where we should begin, so I will turn it over to Hector.
Well, I was born and raised in Los Angeles, and for me, LA, a place of reinvention, obviously, and that is the idea of reinvention is the thing that brings together for me the two parts of LA. The LA that is in world culture as Hollywood, as the capital of the entertainment industry, both music and film. And the other LA, which is the LA that I know, which is both migrant and immigrant LA. And for me, immigrant LA is Iowa, migrant LA is Iowa, it's Idaho, it's Louisiana, it's Guatemala, it's Korea, even Brazil. And so my own parents came here in the 1960s from Guatemala with this idea of peasant reinvention. They came from very, very poor surroundings. And to me, there are, in the years that I've been, 20, 30 years as a reporter, there are just parallels with all of these other Los Angeles stories. I mean, it goes back to Fonte. Fonte in the 1930s, John Fonte, Ask the Dusk, writes about coming out to Los Angeles in the 1930s, and he lives in a very working class district, Bunker Hill. And it's that same story. It's this idea of coming to a place of newness, the blank slate. You know, it's where you start new. And so for me, the desperation of those places and the pain of those places is really what defines Los Angeles. It's the pain of the place you're escaping from, or it is the limitations of the place you're escaping from. And you come to this place where allegedly and supposedly, and sometimes you can actually see that anything really is possible. And so for me, that's the definition of what, you know, that's the tension of what defines Los Angeles.
I think that in my first novel, The Chinchilla Farm, it was very much that. A young woman leaves this small town in Utah where she was raised, and she comes to Los Angeles. And the book ends in Mexico. So Los Angeles becomes the place of transformation. Los Angeles is the other. Los Angeles is that place of possibility where you can wake up not just in a new place, but as a new person. I mean, you get that feeling that many people felt that kind of possibility. And yet I think that was always its own kind of fiction in a way.
Right.
I think that what Los Angeles is an incredibly complex landscape that's so hard to get hold of. And as hard as writers try to get hold of this place, it's proved so elusive because there, in fact, isn't one Los Angeles. And I think that there's something about a city that's built the way that Los Angeles is that makes people very unsettled, very nervous, because of that lack of a kind of center and a sense of a city. But for me, as a place of transformation, that was the way that I first used it in fiction. And in fact, when I was living in Idaho in the 1970s, and I was teaching skiing, and I was dreaming of becoming a writer, Los Angeles is the place that I came to become a writer. I wanted to be around other people who were doing what I wanted to do. And I suppose that if I had been born in Pennsylvania, I would have gone to New York. But to me, Los Angeles was the only choice, not San Francisco, not Seattle, not those places, because somehow I must have intuited that Los Angeles really is the place of reinvention. And as charming as San Francisco is, and as lovely as Seattle is, there is something about this landscape. There's some frisson, some stuff, some edge, some craziness. You know, Chandler said it was the crackpot capital of the world. It was, that's the stuff writers deal with and work with. And I felt it was as though this was where the continent ended. This was the place that if you turned America up like a tea kettle and poured it out, this was where it would end up. This was the place of accumulation of myths and of desires and longings and also possibilities. And it's also almost an unfathomable place. Right. And that kind of mystery and unfathomableness makes it an extremely fertile ground for writers. You know, Chandler said in The Little Sister, real cities have something else, some bony structure under the muck. Los Angeles has Hollywood, and you know, should consider itself lucky, because without it, it's just another mail order city. Right. You know, nothing of the best, but everything in the catalog. So for me, Los Angeles is so wonderfully elusive and so full of possibility and energy and vitality. And it's that vitality that makes it a constantly fascinating and sort of rich landscape as a writer.
Well, I think that for me, you know, my relationship with LA is really the kind of story of my, not just my professional life, but of my sort of life such as it is. And I grew up in the north of England in an industrial kind of hellhole called Bradford, and which my children, who are native Los Angelenos now, find incredibly romantic when they go back there. And obviously, growing up, I guess I would have experienced LA first of all in a completely subconscious way, just through the Rockford Files.
Right. Exactly.
Just
Dragnet.
there it is in the background, and the opening shot of Touch of Evil, which, being a film buff from a very early age, I kind of put together, okay, that was that long, immensely long tracking shot that begins Touch of Evil was actually filmed in Venice, where I now live. And I started coming to LA as a journalist in the 80s, and there was something about the place that kind of clearly called to something that was broken in me that kind of may not even be fixed yet. And it was this kind of thing of possibility. And I was working for a magazine at the time, was kind of called out to go and interview David Lynch, go and interview John Milius, go and interview Eddie Murphy, whoever it was. And this was back in the day when you get kind of decent expenses to do this kind of thing. And I'd go to the Chateau Marmont, and I met a girl here who improbably, this sounds so fantastic and absurd, but she was a Playboy bunny, and I had an affair with her, and that became the subject of my first book, LA Without a Map. It all ended kind of very badly, and so that was, I saw LA when I first came here as a kind of surreal comedy, and as I looked into the kind of writing about the place, I realized that there's a strain of Los Angeles writing which is just that, where the person from outside comes and looks at LA in this kind of pop-eyed way, and the kind of guiding original book of that, I suppose, is Nathaniel West's Day of the Locust. And at the same time, I was kind of discovering Chandler, and it was apparent to me that Chandler wrote about LA in a very different way, which is to say that someone who clearly, it was much more in his bones than it was for West, who kind of came and saw this extraordinary surreal catalogue of people coming here from the Midwest or wherever with the dream of making it in Hollywood and just getting kind of broken dreams in exchange. And Chandler was clearly much more kind of imbued in the landscape and what the weather was like and what the sound of the place was like. And another famous Chandlerism is Los Angeles is a city with the personality of a paper cup. And I think he intended that as a compliment, which is to say that you got a paper cup and you can put what you like in it. And in a way, you know, as I kept coming back here until finally then moved here with my now wife, intending to stay for 6 months in 1990, and we've been here ever since. And the story of my relationship with LA has been of this kind of deepening experience that I reported on the riots for English papers, the Rodney King riots in 92, 91, for The Guardian and for Granta, and that kind of led to my getting gigs with the New York Times, reporting about LA cops, and I started seeing the city in a different way, so I went from this position of being extremely innocent about it to really discovering the complexity of it, the darkness of it, the sort of the unknowability of it,
I
the kind of secrecy of it.
Yeah, I think that's what's really exciting about being a writer in Los Angeles, is that there are so many different threads of American and world history that meet and cross here. And so whatever you're it's like a buffet of narrative. You know, even in my own life story, I sort of have all these different strands of the American experience crisscross. You know, my parents come from Guatemala. They're the Latin American, you know, migration. But my parents meet, when they're young immigrants, they meet my godfather, who's this African American civil rights teenager from Memphis, who's escaped from Memphis because his parents are afraid that he's going to be killed in Memphis by the Klan. And so he becomes my godfather in Hollywood. And then right behind our house, behind our duplex on Harold Way in Hollywood, there James Earl Ray lived.
Wow.
You know, he was actually living in this apartment before he went to go kill Martin Luther King. And so, I mean, every LA individual, to me, contains all these potential strands of stories, you know? And that's what makes it sort of really a rich, fertile ground for a writer. You know, LA is a really old city. You know, for me, there is there is an original point to LA, which is where the Arroyo Seco and the LA River meet, and that was the center of the city in the 19th century. And yet now there are many different kinds of centers. There are many different places that have left their mark in LA history. And so it's that hugeness of it. There's an Armenian diaspora story, you know, that's told in Los Angeles. There's a Korean diaspora story, you know, that is huge in LA. And so we have and it does feel sort of unknowable, but it just also feels like the whole world is here. You know, there's all these different world narratives that you could sort of sample here in Los Angeles.
This is one thing with the Barbarian Nurseries that really interested me, is having this woman, Araceli, which is unlike any voice I've read before, who is a Mexican domestic who wears a uniform and goes into these improbable adventures that are so linked to Los Angeles that after reading it, you just feel like taking a walking tour, or that you've done a walking tour. Mm-hmm. And I wonder about that connection to the material, because it is, it feels there feels like a kind of specificity, such as Joyce had to Dublin, with this kind of, this is my turf, people, right. Pay attention.
That was what I was trying to do, actually. No, I think that she is my alter ego, because she is an intellectual trapped in the body of a servant. See, I am Guatemalan American, and if you say Guatemalan in LA, the stereotype is of someone who comes, you say I had 3 Guatemalan guys in my house, it means that they were there to work on your floors, you know? And so I grew up with that. You know, people mistake me, hey, you know, how much do you charge to cut my lawn? You know, well, I'm just walking, but, you know, it's like, that's the kind of, I dealt with this my whole life. And so I had this intellectual sort of, you know, aspirations. And so I gave those to Araceli, and I made her this observer. And I really wanted I wanted to do what I think every writer needs to do when you come to a new place, which is to take a stereotype and examine it and destroy it. You know, find out what's inside of it, find the truths in the stereotype, and find the myths behind it. And so I purposely wanted to take the idea of the Mexican housekeeper, and I wanted to find the real human being in there. And so since I have, you know, there have been women in my family who have worked in houses. My aunt worked in Beverly Hills in a mansion that I would go visit when I was 8 or 9 years old. I would go and swim in the pool when the family was swimming. When the family went on vacation in Europe, we would go to this Beverly Hills mansion, and I would swim in the pool when I was a little boy. And so I sort of know that part of the experience. And I also am an upper middle class American now with, you know, intellectual aspirations and kids who are in prep school. And so I know this whole other reality, and I try to have Araceli react to that, you know, and I think that's you know, the city gives us realities that we think we know on the surface, and it's our job as novelists, right, as writers, as nonfiction writers or as fiction writers, to find the human truths that are in there, and that's sort of what I try to do with Araceli.
And I think Judith has done that with the chinchilla farm, and Richard, you've done that in LA without a map. I mean, that idea of taking this figure that comes in from outside and becomes part of the place. Judith, do you want to talk about that a little bit with Chinchilla Farm?
Well, you know, it did represent the other. You know, it definitely represented the other. That the protagonist leaves the cold, northern, strict, white world of Mormon Utah and comes into LA with all of its kaleidoscopic color
Libertine.
and libertine and kind of unfathomability and also possibility. Anything's possible. Anything's possible here. And then moves through that kind of transformative world into Mexico, which is even more full of color and light and other. So in a way, in that book, this was the catalyst and the transformative place. But I just want to pick up on a couple of things also that Hector said. One of the things I loved about your book, Hector, and I'm still into it, but there is a moment where Arceli looks out the window and she sees this landscape where the rich people have built their house and she's working for them, and there's some kind of phrase about how the house where the vanquished meadows bled through. And I think in LA there's always that sense of the landscape just underneath,
Right.
just underneath, that we're not so old, that it bleeds through, that we have a spine of mountains, the Santa Monica Mountains, and that this was one great plano, and that the river is uncontrollable, and that we've corralled it, but that Watts was once called Mud Town because it just flooded, and that as much as the humans have made this imprint on this landscape, that, I love that the vanquished meadows, were sort of bleeding through. It's not true that we don't have history, but it's quite recent.
Or
And
we don't know
underneath
it,
that
yeah.
is just,
And the scale is so different.
Well, I think
From other places.
the thing about writing in LA and history is actually kind of really interesting. I think that as we've become, we all know that LA has become much more self-conscious in its looking at itself. And if you look at the writing that people did about LA in the 20s and 30s, there was a lot of non-fiction writing that was done, and that people would, Edmund Wilson came here, there was a very excellent early book on LA by someone called Morrow Mayo, the book was just called Los Angeles, which kind of told for the very first time the history of the water wars, the theft of the water from the Owens River Valley, which between 1908 and 1913, which summoned into being LA. And all the writing about LA at that time, it's the city kind of considered as phenomena.
Right.
That how did this happen, that this place had a population of 100,000 in 1910 and a population of 2 million by 1930. That's the period of sort of maximum growth. And we and what's happened since then is that history has accreted and accreted and accreted and accreted to the point where we now sort of actually examine LA history. And my central metaphor for this is that still the Owens River Valley, where the LA took the water, 100 square miles of the Owens Valley was turned into an alkali salt lake. And we think that story has kind of gone away, and actually it really hasn't. The DWP still owns all of that land. There's been an ongoing dispute about the fact that this land was turned into a salt bed, which creates alkali dust storms, and which damage the lungs of the people living in the Owens Valley. And so there has been, over the decades, a movement there, which has now resulted in the fact that the DWP, in order to kind of prevent the salt rising from the lake, is actually kind of building little lakes, which within the salt bed, to sort of, the water evaporates, dampens down the salt rising, and the city of LA is spending $25,000 a day pumping water into the lake that the city of LA drained more than 60, 70 years ago, in order to try and conform, which we're failing to conform with EPA regulations about the dust levels. And this is the sort of, for me, the metaphor of LA, that the Faulkner, the past isn't dead, it isn't even the past. and the story of our relationship with water, which the city wouldn't be here were it not for that.
Which constitutes part of the scale of Los Angeles, and also its aspect of as being a region in terms of regional writing, which is not at all, it's actually a very distinct definition of a kind of writing that's related to the terrain. And when you think about our inherited mythologies of Los Angeles, like Chinatown and like Fontaine.
Yeah, LA is big enough that it has sub-literatures. We have Susan Straight, who writes about the Inland Empire, and we have a whole literature of East Los Angeles a lot of people don't know about. Alejandro Morales, the Brig People, and the Revolt of the Cockroach People, which if you grew up in Boyle Heights or East LA, you sort of know about that literature. So yeah, it has all these incredible sub-literatures.
But I think it even goes beyond that. If you think about Joan Didion and Play It As It Lays, the footprint of LA extends to Vegas, I think. I think Vegas is actually so informed by the sensibility of LA.
I grew up in Las Vegas, and I must say it's true.
And it's funny how when the gangsters were driven out of LA in 1939, when there was as Richard knows very well from his wonderful book, there was a real attempt to clean up this city because the corruption was so exquisite. It was so widespread. It was so extraordinary. From the press to the police, to the city offices. It was just so corrupt. And in 1939, and there was a huge attempt to clean it up, and those gangsters left LA. And they moved out to this little windblown desert, called Las Vegas. And if you look at Didion's Play It As It Lays, she's really from a town. Mariah, her main character, is from a town called Silver Wells, which is again a kind of offshoot of Vegas. And I feel like LA has this extraordinary footprint, that its sensibility extends, to Baker and Vegas and San Diego and North. It's not just what we think of as Los Angeles.
And it is this inheritance that Richard defines in A Bright and Guilty Place. I love your definition of noir in this kind of like, the kind of darkness. And in some of our email exchanges before tonight's panel, this idea of Los Angeles as a place where these bizarre murders happen, where this crime flourishes.
I love that Richard said, Los Angeles has the most interesting murders.
The best murders ever.
Yeah.
Keeping alive the tradition right now, actually.
Yeah.
And what Richard's point about what's going on now, I thought was also fascinating, the way that stories do repeat in LA.
Well, we were talking about the the road cop, and essentially that's another. And what Hector says is quite right, that there are many. And that there always have been, actually, kind of subdivisions of LA writing. There's always been the kind of pop-eyed stranger from outside. There's always been the kind of oppressed immigrant story. These sorts of stories have been present in LA literature really since the very earliest days. And these strands run through and revive themselves and get refurbished by writers as different generations come along. And one of the particular tropes in SoCal storytelling is the bandit on the run. We've had that story since Evans and Sontag, the Visalia bandits. These were the guys who, I don't know if any of you've read Frank Norris's The Octopus, the corporate railway theft of land in the Central Valley. Then led to this tragic shootout at Muscle Slough, which then led to a group of bandits deciding they were going to start robbing Southern Pacific trains. They get caught, they go on the run. Where did they go on the run to? They go onto into the Nevadas. So this story of the person who does something in the flat landscape and then escapes into the Nevadas is another ever-present in Southern California and LA history through Evans and Sontag, through High Sierra, through this
Lady-
amazing story that's unfolding
Lady
right
in the
now.
Lake.
Lady in the Lake.
No Crime in the Mountains. You know.
But Richard, to touch on something you said about the city getting older, I just feel I'm about to turn 50, and I grew up in the 1960s, and in my lifetime, the city, it feels to me like LA has gone from adolescence to middle age. Because, when I grew up in the 1960s, the freeways were still being built. And I remember going with my father to the end of the Pomona Freeway. We used to call them, the freeways used to have names before we called them like numbers. Now that would be the 60. But back then, the Pomona Freeway ended in these orange, fields or orchards out in the middle of Pomona. And you would drive to the end of the freeway. I remember the bulldozers at the end of the freeway, and there was a sense of possibility. And that infuses, many of the writers were talking about. This idea that this was this place where anything was possible. This was the place where we built the rockets that went to the moon. And now, age of austerity, budget cuts. There's almost a sense of exhaustion. California is synonymous in the rest of the country. Well, it was, for the Tea Party types, with dysfunction. We were like the Greece of America, right? Do you remember those? Did you get any of those emails, those junk emails that said, look at California, they can't even balance their budget, And so we became this sort of, symbol of dysfunction. And to me, I feel like I can now see like a few more layers of all of this history that we're talking about,
I think
piled on top of, yes.
Yeah, I think there's a definite sense that kind of LA, the basin got filled up and
Right.
the city kind of got used up.
Right.
And that sort of, there has been, when I first came, definitely in the mid-'80s, just after the Olympics, there was this kind of feeling of massive optimism about LA still. And there's a fantastic, there's a famous architectural book by a guy called Rayner called Los Angeles Architecture of Four Ecologies.
Yes.
And one of the other great strands of LA writing is about writing about LA architecture. And he made a very, very good documentary that you can just see on YouTube if you search Rayner Banham. And he was just so filled with enthusiasm for this place that just seemed infinitely possible. And he would have made this, I guess, in the kind of late 60s, early 70s. And I remember when I first came that there were still gaps on Wilshire Boulevard.
Right.
And then at some point in the 90s, everything got filled up. And the whole of LA became more like downtown, where you see the kind of accreted history of the place through its architecture, what's being pulled down, what's being put up.
Although it seems to me that downtown, as someone who lives downtown, is becoming maybe this place that will pull the different parts of the city together. And that was something else I wanted to ask you, because it does seem to me, as someone who's lived mostly in New York most of my life, although I did grow up in Las Vegas, that kind of compactness of a European modeled city is not what we have here. And that's that sprawl and that possibility, there's something intrinsic to it that does something to the imagination of a young artist. And all of you coming of age here, I guess what I wanted to ask is, what drew you to Los Angeles? What made you stay in Los Angeles? And what are the works that you think are intrinsic to being in Los Angeles? And I'm just going to open that up a little bit more, because this darkness that you see as it being more of a dark time than when you came here, it seems like there's also a nostalgia around noir and around looking at Los Angeles as this certain type of place, which is sort of being broken now.
Right.
By writing about more sort of like citizens. So I'm just, boy, that was a lot. But if you want to jump in on any of those. Judith?
I think that's a question for Richard or Hector.
I don't even think it was a question.
Yeah,
Well, I think
I
that
don't know how to think about it.
it's interesting that sort of, when the original city was downtown, and that it started flinging itself outwards through really kind of starting in the late 20s and then through the 30s and 40s, when it really becomes the city of the automobile and the streetcar tracks get pulled up and so on, and the freeways get built, and downtown sort of ceased to be the hub. And I think downtown is becoming more of a hub again,
Right.
simply because the place filled up. We can't go any further out. So we've started looking back to that place where if you go to the top of Angel's Flight and look down, and you see all of that stuff from the 20s, you actually kind of see the LA, you see the layers of LA history right there.
Right.
And I think in a way, you know, what's happened with downtown in the last 5 or 6 years, again, is a sort of metaphor for LA realizing the actuality of its own history.
You know, I used to write a column, weekly and sometimes bi-weekly column for the LA Times. And the only way I could really sort of embrace the whole sort of hugeness of the place was to think of it as a bunch of small little towns that each had its own history. And so, for example, there's Elysian Valley, let's say, you know, for example. Frogtown has a wonderful history. Why do they call it Frogtown? Oh, well, because before they paved over the river, the frogs used to come out. And then they called it Frogtown. It was really proud to be called Frogtown, but then there was a gang called Frogtown. Nobody used that name for a long time. For 30 years, nobody ever called it Frogtown. We were just Elysian Valley. And now, like, there are all these young hipsters living there. Yeah, it's Frogtown, you know? And so every little place has these little arcs of history. Watts, you know? Simon Rodia is Italian-American. Well, Watts was this, you know, Southern European Slavic place, you know, in the 1920s and 30s, and that's why Simon Rodia was there. He was a poor guy from Italy, you know, and he has this artistic vision, he builds this crazy thing, it's in disrepair, it becomes an African-American neighborhood. You can interview dozens of African-American families that remember playing in front of the towers when they were about to fall down, and then come 1990, there's like 4 Virgin of Guadalupes in front of that Watts Towers because it's a Latino neighborhood, right? And now there's so many individual sort of, you know, for me that's the only way that I've really been able to sort of, as a journalist, when I was a journalist, put my arms around it, was to sort of look at the specificity of each place and look at its history. Lincoln Heights was Italian, now it's Latino, but now Lincoln Heights, it's becoming a Southeast Asian, Chinese neighborhood, you know? It's like, wow. And then there's this gentrification that's coming from like Eagle Rock and, you know, and so, you know, and it's just really, I think that there's this hugeness, but there are also many small cities. Leimert Park is a place that has, it's, you know, right now that's synonymous with African American LA. You know, and yet Leimert Park, essentially African Americans inherited this place from white flight, you know, because of the restricted covenants, and so there's this and then now it has this amazing history, you know, it's this cultural center for African American LA, and so, yes, each little place for me that's one way to sort of, as a writer, to grasp it, you know, because as writers, we love set pieces, right? The set piece, it's the essence of a play, it's the essence of a short story, and so we take these little set pieces, and then that's one way to think about it for me.
And they are the people who make the place. I mean,
Right.
they're the people who choose, I will go there now.
I also think it's, you know, just as people felt that they could come here and reinvent themselves, that LA in itself is a place that's constantly reinventing itself, as you say.
Exactly.
And Chandler lived in over 40 different places in and around
I
LA.
loved finding
I
that
didn't
out
know
from
that.
your book.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
I decided that I would track down every place where he ever lived and photograph what I found. And many of those places were gone because LA is constantly turning. It's constantly, you know, turning itself over. And I think when I think of Chandler, I think of this quote from Lawrence Clark Powell. And I think it also says a lot about LA. And what we're talking about is a kaleidoscope. If you could imagine, you know, LA is a kind of kaleidoscope. And he said what Chandler did was that he stopped the Los Angeles kaleidoscope. He arrested the spinning, so confusing to most writers who have tried to see the city clearly. And then he fixed in prose of poetic intensity the brilliant bits and pieces until what we find is a veritable mosaic of greater Los Angeles from San Bernardino to the sea. And Chandler did live from San Bernardino to the sea. He lived all over the map. And that's how I believe that he wrote about the city so well. is that he saw all those little pieces in the kaleidoscope and he fixed them. He got them because it is constantly turning.
Right, because you need the concrete as a writer. You need the concrete, the specific.
You need to land and
you need
fix
to have
it.
you need to have an individual. You need to have, you know,
Right.
and so a life, for, you know, and so yes,
Right.
that's the beginning.
Well, a part of the job, whatever the genre, is to be a reporter.
Right.
It's just
Right.
to sort of to bring the news, whether you're writing fiction or non-fiction, is that sort of the concrete specificity of the character, of the story, of the place, and that though Wyvern references Chandler, as Judith says, is that though he was writing in this kind of narrow genre that was already kind of quite shock-worn, even at the time that he was recreating it,
Wow.
nonetheless, he sort of, because he brought such a specific eye to LA, and also the fact that he had lived here for such a long time, and that the story of his reporting in his beautiful poetic prose on what he sees through Marlowe's eyes is actually the story of his own growing disenchantment.
Yeah.
Mm.
And
Wow.
so that the long
Yeah.
goodbye is really Chandler saying goodbye to LA.
Goodbye. And he had said
Goodbye.
said goodbye. But I think you brought up something too, actually, the last thing I'll say, but when you talked about your aunt working in a house in Beverly Hills, that's what Chandler got to.
Mm.
He got every class in this city. He got the Murdochs and the Sternwoods and the rich people modeled on the Dohenis, and he got the thugs and the gangsters and the barmaids, and he got the entire spectrum, not only of geography, but of classes of people. And that's part of LA too, big part.
Yeah, my novel, The Barbarian Nurseries, is really a novel about class.
Right.
You know, because class identity is so often hiding in LA as race identity or ethnic identity. You know, that's really a lot of
Yeah.
what my novel is about. It's about class struggle. So yeah.
But I think that's a very, come from England, obviously, where...
You guys invented it.
We invented it, we own that.
You know class.
Thank
But
you.
then I always thought this was the sort of, that LA is the most class-ridden
Yes.
place.
Oh.
And that's,
Britt is telling us that. Oh, that hurts.
that's a
Yeah.
great subject to limb out
Yeah,
those
just drive around.
divisions. Just drive around or be
Yeah.
on the bus and
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
see
Well,
it.
this is, these are three, we could talk all night about, I would have so many questions for all of you, but I know that some of you must have questions brewing. And so for the next, I guess, 10 minutes, we'll take questions,
Or longer.
or longer, we'll take questions. Hector's game. Hector's here all night. No, I'm just kidding. So if anyone has a question, yes, yes.
I know LA is a very young city, and so Los Angeles has a very interesting, I think, an antagonistic relationship with its history. And I know you guys have mentioned the history already, but because it's so young, I feel like sometimes it can't get away from the history. So when you're writing, do you ever have issues with separating Los Angeles now and Los Angeles past?
I feel almost, I write novels that are set, I've written 2 novels that are set more or less in the last 20 years. For me, the present, And I just felt like the past was one more part of the texture of what I was writing, It's like when you write a novel, especially, or any work, a narrative work that's long, you really want to show what a badass you are and how much you know, that's part of it. And how much that, and not just how much you know, like facts, but how many emotions you know. And so for me, the history of LA is all of these different emotions. It's sort of loss and it's ambition, it's creativity. And so all of those things are embedded in the landscape. And so for me, and there's a continuity. The continuity, there are still people doing what people did in the 1910s. That was a big boom period in LA, 1910s and 20s. So for me, those 2 things are one and the same, the present and the past.
I think we're always moving back and forth between those worlds. When you're writing, most fiction, most nonfiction, somehow deals with the fact that whatever the past is, it's inescapable, and it's always going to be a part of the story. And I mean, I'm not sure if that exactly addresses your question, but I don't feel like there's a greater split or conundrum or dichotomy here than there is really anywhere. I don't know.
No, I think it depends on the particular character and the story that you're writing. I think if you're writing an LA thriller, you've got to be aware of the fact that you might not be the first person on the block who's tried to do that, and there's a fantastic history of that type of writing, in the same way that if you were a British writer coming here in your 20s to, oh, I'm going to write a first novel set in LA, you'd have to be aware that there's a whole history of people writing that kind of book that goes from Evelyn Waugh to Christopher Isherwood to down and down and down to Will Self to myself in some smaller way, and so that, you know, that I think history is something that kind of, if you're working in a particular genre, you need to look at the rich histories of particular genres that LA has, but in terms of what the history of the city is and how it might apply to your city, to your story, that really depends on what the work is and who the character is and what the story is that you're trying to tell.
And you each have a very interesting relationship to research as well. It seems the amount of research you do, how it figures in your work. Yes.
Yeah, you know, several years ago, the LA Humanities Institute did a panel on Los Angeles. And the first people to speak were the historians, and they all lamented, oh, there's no shared narrative about the city. And then the writers came up, and I think it was James Elroy, Walter Moses, they, oh, beautiful, wonderful, cool, you know, there's no shared narrative, because that gave them, you know, in some sense, a little more freedom, I mean, I think right now there has been accretion of the history, so there is a little bit more shared narrative. What I love about your work is that you guys work both as historians and creative artists. And so on the one hand, you are contributing to the shared narrative of the history, while you're also, as creative artists, you know, adding something and inventing something.
Nice.
You know,
That's a
that
nice
is
thought.
And I really, you know, when you're talking about the tension between history and literature, how do you embrace both roles in that way? I mean, one question I was going to ask is, even, you know, writers now in LA define cliches about LA, that's almost become a cliche itself, and I was wondering how you deal with that. But the other question is if you had to teach a course on Los Angeles, you know, and literature and mythologies, if you had just 2 or 3 books to include, of course you could more still include more, but if you would have like one that you would feel would be essential, and then one book that might just be a surprise, you know, that might be, you know, a little bit more of a surprise or a little bit more less acknowledged, you know, just so we can contribute to our own knowledge and reading.
My one key book, just for the history of LA, would undoubtedly be Carey McWilliams' Southern California, Island on the Land.
USC undergraduate.
And that's a terrific, you know, it's still, even though it's the history of LA up till 46 when he published it, it still limbs out a lot of the issues that address the city now. So that's my favorite, even above all the fiction, that's my favorite LA book.
Any choice for a surprise?
We were trying to remember the name of the novel that features LA sliding into the ocean after an earthquake at the end. I like Dan Ryan's Angel's Flight, which is one of the very, very first novels that had a kind of noirish tinge, published in 27.
I don't know that book. I don't think I have a surprise. You know, it's odd about LA, because when I think of LA literature, and you just named books that were published before, but I feel like the real moment that LA was put on the map was 1939.
Right.
With Ask the Dust,
Right.
The Big Sleep, and
Day of the Locust.
Day of the Locust. And that those 3 books came out the same year.
It's astonishing.
It's astonishing. You know, it's as though LA suddenly just burst open with this storytelling.
That's also the same year as Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind, right?
Gone with the
So
Wind,
it's like
exactly.
an amazing year for
Okay.
And
Los Angeles
also
film.
Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, which isn't L.A., but it is. in a
Okay, so
sense-
I'm sorry, I'm gonna write a novel now called 1939. And they're all gonna meet in
Great
Well,
different
and that's
panel.
when we sent everybody to
Excellent.
Vegas, right? That's when we sent everybody to Vegas too. Maybe that's part of it.
When was, They Shoot Horses, Don't They? When was that? Was that earlier?
It's earlier, yeah. Right.
Just children now with hobby stories.
Well, I was gonna say mention Ask the Dust because I really loved Fonte's portrait of this neighborhood that doesn't even exist anymore. You know, Bunker Hill was destroyed, you know, to build all those shining towers that you can see on the top of the financial district, you know. They were all there. We had this wonderful old sort of San Francisco style neighborhood of all these Victorian houses and, you know, flop houses, and all these interesting people lived there, and the neighborhood was destroyed. And you can read about it in Ask the Dust, and it's wonderful. You know, I think a nonfiction book that got a little discredited in its day, but it's very interesting just for its very dark take on LA, is Mike Davis's City of Courts. You know, it's a nonfiction book, a series of essays, but really a fascinating look at, you know, late 20th century Los Angeles as this, you know, locus of conflict and ecological disaster. And it was, you know, he got into trouble because he made a few things up, including saying that he had quoted a story of mine that did not exist. But his heart was in there. There was an emotional truth that was there, you know. And so, you know, but it's a really great book that was very influential for a lot of people at that time. That would be my surprise.
Yes.
I was thinking about, I'm just going to go there, because we mentioned songwriters and that part of the art world and the creative world as well. And I'm a huge Stevie Nicks fan, right? And Stevie Nicks came to LA from the Bay Area to be a rock star, right? And in 1974, before she was a rock star, she wrote a song called After the Glitter Fades, which is about being a huge rock star. So there's an aspirational quality to it, right? Everything she touches turns to gold. She was cleaning houses when she wrote the song, right? And then, of course, she spent most of the 80s with cocaine and rehab. And so the connection within LA as well of what we might call the perils of success, right? This is what Mariah goes through a little bit in Late as It Lays. And there are lots and lots and lots and lots of versions of that. You'll never eat lunch in this town again, for example, to Julia Phillips' memoir. To pay the IRS $900,000 cocaine dollars. You know, so that to me is also because the successes are so kind of high and often so brief, the one-hit wonder aspect of it as well, and that there's so many potential pitfalls within. You can have everything, the Michael Jackson story. You know, you can have everything, and therefore you end up with nothing.
Well,
Right?
this-
So it seems to me that's part of the, maybe it's the new noir, I don't know.
Well, actually, it's interesting you say that. There's a very early Scott Fitzgerald story, which was published in the 20s, which is about a movie star being brought low by the fact that he's had an affair with a girl on the lot, and he's banged her up, and it's a very short little tale, and we just know that this sort of, the guy's come out of the Midwest, he's become a star, he's fabulously wealthy and successful and famous, and the story is ending where we just know it's all going to come crashing
Yeah.
down. And yeah, that's another kind of great
Narrative,
trope.
Yeah.
And I think it's something that's underappreciated about LA is that also exists in working class LA, you know, and it's like a constant sort of repeated theme. You know, like I remember driving through at the beginning of the Great Recession, you know, I'd come back to LA after living 7 years abroad, and everyone had all this cash. And so you could go to like a really, you know, down on its, you know, luck corner of South LA that had a building boom. And so there would be like this, you know, Latino family that had added like, you know, they had gone and gotten some, you know, triple mortgage or something. They'd added like 3 rooms and they hadn't been able to finish it. And now the house was for sale because they couldn't pay their mortgage. And so, yeah, there's many different levels of that sort of excess where you can just really ruin your life with just all of this opportunity. And, you know, it's a cycle. We repeat it over and over again. In my neighborhood where I live in Mount Washington, all the sidewalks have a stamp that says 1927. because that's when they laid this really expensive concrete sidewalk in Mount Washington, because that was the big boom period in LA. That's when they built the Los Angeles version of Wall Street. The stock exchange they finished it in 1929, like 8 months before the crash. And so yeah, this is a kind of sort of constant kind of thing. We're addicted to boom. I mean, I felt that when I came back here from Latin America. Everyone had at least one really fancy thing. Like you could go to Starbucks, you see some guy, he'd drive up in his Porsche, but it'd be like, the Starbucks in South Pasadena, so he wasn't that rich, And so, but he had the Porsche, And so that's this constant sort of thing, that you could have your one thing, your bling, whatever it is.
Well,
And,
then it's
and
one-
I think this I'm sorry, Richard.
Sorry, it's one of McWilliams's points that the history of LA is the history of boom and bust.
Right.
Yeah.
That as applied to both the city itself and to individuals, that it's just a
Yeah.
cyclical.
One of Hockney's paintings has on it the language at the bottom. It says, "Surface is illusion, but so is depth." Underneath the Los Angeles swimming pool. We have time for one more. Yes. Yes.
Oh, I'm just thinking that talking about Los Angeles as being always offering kind of potential and transformation. That's part of the story. And I think somewhere in there there's also a story underneath of that attraction, that seduction. Because when I think of Los Angeles, I think of it as a story of extras. It's a town of extras. You talk about class. It's a town of extras that. And for me personally, the quintessential LA story is They Shoot Horses.
Yeah.
Which is at the edge, goes as far out as you possibly can, and is a tale of extras. And McCoy has another story about extras. It's not No Pockets in a Shroud, but it's another one as well. And I think Chandler comes up behind that and picks up on the story of extras, which is both a story of possibility and potential and failed potential, and also the modern story and the modern post-modern. We're now in a world of extras. Nobody matters at some point, and I think that gets picked up in Idiot, and ultimately gets picked up in Less Than Zero, which is the bitch goddess offers all the potential in the world, but we all end up finding that we're just extras.
If we're lucky.
Yeah, I think
Well, that's the
the
day
point.
the locust tale.
Yeah.
McCoy's story is actually quite interesting because he'd been a Texas Ranger, and he came here and married the daughter of an oil baron, and this was in the late 20s, and then his father-in-law lost all the money in the crash, so he lived the story that he then wrote so amazingly in They Shoot Horses, Don't They?
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember the other. I know the novel you mean.
It's not. No,
I should have stayed home.
I Should Have Stayed Home. That's it. Yeah.
Good title. Well, thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you to our brilliant